introducing myself. I know some of you from Looking Inward, Moving Forward. My name is Cliff Johnson. We're relatively new members of the church. We joined and then COVID hit, so we didn't have many days in the building before we went home. And I was talking about the ways in which we were thinking about looking inward, moving forward in the context of actions that the church might take after we really did this anti-racism journey together, and the tensions that exist in a lot of churches between the desire to be really engaged in what happens in our community, but also to do it in a way that doesn't divide the church or that people can feel that they're a part of and have a voice in. And so when I started thinking about this Sunday and the opportunity to bring someone in to address that, something I thought in my mind for purposes of this adult forum could be helpful, the first person who came to my mind is my friend Brandon Jones. Brandon and I work closely together day after day, week after week, and he has a background I think that's helpful and some insights in this regard. Brandon went to the same small Baptist undergraduate college I went to in Clinton, Mississippi College. He was some years after me. He's a much younger man. And then Brandon took a path that I think puts him in this position of having some perspective that many of us don't have. He got a seminary degree. He went to Wake Forest Theological Seminary in Winston-Salem and got an MDiv at Wake Forest. And then immediately after getting his MDiv, he attended law school at Mercer University in Georgia. Brandon was for years a trial lawyer, tried a lot of cases to juries, mostly on behalf of plaintiffs, and was then elected to office from the Mississippi Gulf Coast, served in the House for how long, Brandon?
4 years.
4 years in the House from the coast, was exposed to how the sausage is made in the legislature, and then after he finished his private practice career and moved into policy at the Southern Poverty Law Center, he brought those skills from his political life into the social justice space. As we've been trying to work collaboratively at the MacArthur Justice Center on meaningful reform, very complicated place that is Mississippi, Brandon's been out on the tip of the spear and helping us think about what policy might look like, but also maintain and take advantage of relationships across traditional divisions in a way that Brandon is very adept at doing. And so I introduced to you my friend Brandon Jones to help us think about what we've been talking about at All the While, which is how do we move forward, having spent so much time looking inward. So Brandon, I'll give it to you. Sure. You might let these ones get settled in.
Hey, for those of us watching, we're letting some people get settled in for just a moment, so bear with us. Well, good morning. It's really good to be with you. I'm delighted to be here at Idlewild. It is my first time in your church. I'm not completely uninitiated though. I'm a former elder in PCUSA Church down on the Mississippi coast. So I have spent some time around Presbyterian churches, and look, I will tell you, your reputation as a caring church in Memphis precedes you. I'm excited about some of what Cliff has told me about some of this recent work, but I'm aware of the long history here in the city, and commend you for continuing to challenge yourselves is how I see it. Continuing through this most difficult time of pandemic and societal upheaval. So it's an exciting place to be, and thank you all for inviting me into it. As Cliff said, I did a tour of small Baptist colleges. That was my educational experience. I was raised in a Baptist church. I didn't go into seminary expecting to be a pastor. I was actually encouraged to go because I was told by a dear friend of mine, a professor, that seminary was a great place of vocational discernment. And that was something that I needed. And so during my time at seminary, I interned for a group called the Baptist Joint Committee on Public Affairs, which is a First Amendment group, does work on separation of church and state, pretty stuff. And that's where I met people who were practicing law in interesting ways and who also had kind of an interest in theology, things of that nature. And so it was a kind of a perfect timing. I was there in 2000. Some of you may remember the 2000 election. It's an interesting time to live on Capitol Hill and work there. And so from that time forward, I kind of knew I wanted to practice law and have something to do with this conversation about where we are as a country and some of the decisions that we're making. So Cliff is right. I did go to law school after that in Georgia, got married in the meantime, and my wife and I moved to my hometown of Pascagoula in 2005, just in time for Hurricane Katrina, which came through in August of that year. And my first child was born in January of the following year. So we put a lot of big events, the move, the bar exam, Katrina, new child, right there in a short several months. And it was during that process of seeing what was going on within the insurance industry there on the Gulf Coast and people struggling to put their lives back together and homes back together, that I kind of saw an angle on a way to get involved in the politics of my state and of the region. And so in 2007, as Cliff said, did run for the House of Representatives. Now, just by way of biography, I'm not here to urge any of you to be any more partisan than you might already be, but I will tell you, I did run as a Democrat in a small town in Mississippi that happened to be the same town that Trent Lott was from, who was, you may know, is a very prominent Republican who at that time had a pretty, decent footprint there in the nation's capital and a major chairman. I won that race by 11 votes. Well, first of all, I won the Democratic primary by 19 votes, and I won the general election by 11 votes. And then we had a speaker's race, which we won by 2 votes. And so I was kind of a walking civics lesson there in my early days of getting initiated to electoral politics. And there was something about having that narrow margin in the House that meant that those 62 of us had to be in leadership positions, whereas before, bigger margins spread out the work a little bit. But because of that narrow margin, it kind of threw all of us into roles that we wouldn't have otherwise had. And so it would be pretty unusual, historically speaking, in Mississippi for a newly elected member to be the vice chairman of the insurance committee. But that's where I found myself. And I mentioned to you, that was one of the issues that drove me to get involved in the first place. So learned a lot about the process, learned a lot about some of the positive sides of policymaking and some of the challenges of it. Because we were such a small majority, and because we had Governor Haley Barbour, who some of you may be familiar with, he has a national reputation, and he was such an organized and strategic thinker. We had just some really exciting dust-ups and political fights. I got to give the response to the state of the state in my second year in the House, and got a real, I think, interesting political education. When I left public office, I think the question for me was, well, I still care deeply about the state. I still care deeply about public policy. How do I parlay some of this experience into something that matters? And for me, what that primarily meant was volunteer. As Cliff mentioned, I was an attorney by practice and litigator primarily. So I tried to find ways to get to volunteer for campaigns, to volunteer for different initiatives that might be moving through. And over the course of years, came to realize that I really wasn't satisfied having that as a hobby, that I really wanted that work to be the main work. And so that's when I joined the Southern Poverty Law Center and the policy director. And by the way, the policy department's a relatively new thing at the SPLC. Some of you who might be familiar with us might know that the SPLC got its start primarily by bringing lawsuits against the Ku Klux Klan, and was a civil rights law firm. And they, early in their history, developed something called Hate Watch, where they track different hate groups and they put out publications on that and educate communities on, where hate activity is taking place. And here, very recently, in the last 2 years, decided to add a policy arm to that. So that's the part where I work in this kind of lobbying space, where we lobby state and local governments for policies that we think are in line with our values and that are in line with what, our lawyers are trying to do within the courtroom. In the middle of all that, as I mentioned, grew up Baptist. The Southern Baptist Church is where I grew up, and some of you might be aware, experienced a lot of turbulence in the 70s. That continued on into the 80s and 90s. So by the time I was getting to a point coming into adulthood, I really didn't have a church home, I felt. And so that's how I, as a law school student, found a PCUSA church and began attending one in Madison, Georgia. And then when I moved back to Pascagoula, attended the PCUSA church. Moved after that to Madison and ended up in United Methodist Church, where I am now. I'm a Sunday school teacher and an active member of our United Methodist Church in Madison, Mississippi. So I've been kind of an active layperson in 3 different denominations, and I think what I've experienced in terms of how we've dealt with some of the major tensions of the day, whether it be in some cases in the Baptist life, ordination of women, which is not controversial in other places, but was there. How we accept and affirm gay people in our congregations and how our congregations organize themselves with that respect. That a lot of those social issues that we grapple with on the outside, certainly here in the last year and a half more acutely, race and racism and what it means to be anti-racist, as you all know, don't stop at the doors of the church house, and in many ways affect us. And in some ways, our response has been, instead of being a leading response that gives society something to have a model after, and unfortunately, the tail wags the dog oftentimes. And our churches don't handle these issues any better in some cases than society at large. And so, if you've been thinking about that, that's something that I've been thinking about for a long time, and it's been kind of a backbeat of some of the work that I've done with congregations and communities. That this stuff is tough, and while we might expect as people of faith and as people who should be thinking in a compassionate way about these various issues, sometimes we're neophytes. Sometimes these conversations have been brushed aside or put away in such a way that we haven't really tackled them in deliberate ways as you all are starting to do. I thought it might be helpful for me to just share with you all a little bit of what policy work we are doing in Mississippi and how I think it sort of intersects with this idea of anti-racism and what are some responsible ways that people can take a look at issues in their community or in their state and try to put one foot in front of the other in terms of being, kind of people that I think we want to be as members of society, but also, for me, as a person of faith, doing this kind of work. So some of you may be aware that Mississippi did something that Mississippi doesn't do, and that was make a really good statewide policy change last year. We were the last state to take down the Confederate battle emblem off of our state flag, which got a lot of people's attention because that's obviously not the type of grand gesture that Mississippi is known for. But there was an undercard that was on that ballot. You may not be aware of this, but it wasn't something that was done with the stroke of the governor's pen. The way that Mississippi changed its state flag was through an election process. So the legislature passed a measure that allowed it to be on the state ballot, and then that measure had to pass by overwhelming majority. Thankfully it did. But the undercard on that was this old Jim Crow provision that was stuck in the 1890 Mississippi Constitution that required any statewide elected official to win not only a simple majority, but also an electoral college of all the House districts within the state. And so what that meant, it was intentional to dilute black vote in Mississippi and to dilute the election of black political leadership. Because even if someone was fortunate enough to overcome that majority vote on a statewide scale, they then would have to have the majority of those very dramatically gerrymandered House districts throughout the state. So it was an almost impossible hill to climb, and it had come up twice in recent history where elections had been pitched into the legislature for a decision based on that second rule. So we joined with 22 grassroots organizations in Mississippi to do conversations, community conversations, and community education around why we wanted to get rid of that old vestige of Jim Crow law in Mississippi. And began to do some of that hard community work of getting the people of Mississippi to sort of face up to some of that hard history, to sort of acknowledge that we had hardwired into our Constitution something that disenfranchised thousands of Mississippians, and that formed part of the groundwater for how our state politics were done. And as you might imagine, there was some defensiveness around that. There were sometimes when you initiate that conversation or you put the mirror to issues like that, you get some anger, some denial, some that wasn't us, that's ancient history. But what was really remarkable to me is that over the course of time, that resistance sort of started to fade away as people started to reckon with, well, there is something we can do about that. There's a way for us to sort of reckon with this here on this ballot. And I don't think it's a small thing. To me, it's kind of a modern miracle that more people voted in favor of removing that racist vestige than they did for anything else on the ballot. A ballot that included medical marijuana, a ballot that included some Republican candidates without even an opponent. It was, a very interesting ballot, and I thought it was just extremely notable that at the end of the day, it was that little Jim Crow provision that Mississippians went in for to a tune of 77%, I believe it was. So it's an incredible kind of moment there, which for me is quite encouraging along some of the lines of the conversations you all have been having about if a state like Mississippi can reckon in a small way with a piece of its history and not allow its defensiveness or its defense mechanisms to overwhelm the day, but can kind of face that cold and make a positive decision like that. I think there's something there to be encouraged about building on. And what I've learned also is you don't necessarily stay there with these policy victories or with these moments of inbreaking. You don't necessarily keep that momentum. It kind of waxes and wanes. So some of the hard work of staying in these conversations and trying to continue to move your communities forward, it requires a certain resilience and a certain understanding that it isn't going to happen in short bursts, that it's going to be a commitment that takes some real time and takes some real commitment beyond just the excitement of a small victory. But I thought that was encouraging. That same group of 22 organizations has decided to stick together, and we're now doing redistricting listening sessions across the state and trainings. As you all may know, state governments organize themselves in their voting districts by this process called redistricting, which takes place every 10 years after the census is performed. So we got initial census numbers earlier in the summer. This month and next month, we'll begin to get detailed precinct level data. And that'll happen here in Tennessee and throughout the country. And what happens is legislators take that data and then draw the political lines for the state, whether it be House districts, congressional districts, judicial districts, all the various ways that we align ourselves politically. At the local level, they'll be drawn for things like school board, county supervisors, and things of that nature. School districts, all kinds of things. Well, that process is extremely important and kind of a piece with that work we started to do around Black political power in Mississippi, along the lines of how do we ensure that people have a fair shot and fair representation through this redistricting process. So what we've been doing is training people up on the mechanics of the process, pointing them towards the committee work and the committee that will ultimately draw these lines in the Mississippi legislature, educating people on how they can write letters to that committee, how they can submit maps to that committee, and how they can come to public hearings and offer, conversations about what their community looks like and how it needs to be drawn in a particular way, or to suggest the way that gerrymandering has hurt them in the past. I mentioned that as we think about the conversations that you all have had, as we think about how do we plug into the very difficult work of trying to make our cities and states better. For me, it's taken a touch of kind of creativity, I think, to be able to see the thread between the conversations we have in Sunday school classes like the ones you all had and how we tackle the issues of the day. And I think if we squint hard enough, you can see that type of challenge within things like redistricting. You can see how, maybe the way that we draw our political lines, maybe we should think about that as an opportunity for anti-racist work. Maybe we should think about that as an opportunity to provide a little touch of reconciliation and healing and reckon with a little bit of a complicated past. And I'll tell you, there's something that has been inspiring about going into different communities and to get different community members to think critically about the way their political lines have been drawn in their own backyard, and perhaps what those political lines have meant, and maybe where communities have been cut in certain ways that have diminished some of their voice in their state capital or in their county, to see the way that sometimes Black folks have been packed together into districts so that it's just one Black district rather than maybe 4 or 5, which was a potential if you were drawing more fairly. And to get them to think about, well, how has our power been diminished? And how do we talk about this in a way that gets people thinking critically about doing it differently? Now, I don't want to be Pollyanna here. Any of you who study the politics of all this are aware that redistricting and many of these political processes are open combat and very difficult. It's unlikely that we're going to win the day with a few compelling stories. But building up that power, building up that narrative, building up a case, building up a record creates opportunities for the potential of filing suit down the road if places are drawn in a particularly bad way, for winning some hearts and minds over through the course of the process, but really building up political will and political power that can be used and harnessed not only in this particular redistricting fight, but in all the various other fights that might follow. So there's something to, again, that kind of commitment to the long game. And we've seen that in this work that we're doing. Another thing that we're working on in our, yeah.
Are there any faith communities, or is there any faith voice among that 22, in the 22 organizations, or coming alongside in the redistricting conversation?
Because I wonder whether we start thinking about being overtly political and how that works for the church, how that's played out there, and what your thoughts are about whether there's space for a congregation that says, gosh, we'd love to be a part of that conversation with you. Could you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, the way, they would certainly be invited into that space. But the way that we have engaged with church communities in both of those processes, whether it was the Jim Crow ballot initiative last year or redistricting this year, has been to use churches that wanted to have community conversations to go and partner with that church to just provide an opportunity for people to do Q&A, town hall type things. There have been some pastors who have been active. There's actually a group of United Methodist Church pastors who have joined together in an anti-racist organization and sort of made themselves available as a kind of an ad hoc volunteer group to help with some of these things. So they've shown up in some ways. But I don't know, Cliff, there's like I don't think we have, for example, a denomination that's joined in or a particular religious organization. Outside, with one exception, Catholic Charities comes in and out on some of that. Yeah.
All right, thank you.
But I mean, it's a point of, I think for churches like yours that are having conversations like the ones you've had, I guess my encouragement around this conversation about redistricting and things like it is that's a way to engage in what is very much a politically loaded thing, very much racially loaded work without being partisan. It's a way for you to engage in something without being, overtly partisan, without threatening tax exempt status, without doing some of those things that you might not have any interest in doing as a church. But it's an issue that affects so many people, to get people thinking about, well, how are we organized, and is it fair? Is it? And I can't help but notice there's a lot of folks in this room and on the screen here that look a lot like me, and that we're white folks. And I hope that in your conversations around anti-racism, you've sort of come to reckon with the fact that that comes with a certain authority and it comes with a certain advantage. And there are ways that I think we're being called in this particular moment to be aware of our whiteness, and that it gives us access and privilege in ways that we might not have been fully thoughtful about. And that when it comes to the way that government works, or the way that groundwater or politics works, folks who look like us can have a heavy hand and a big impact when we say, well, let's think about fairness. Let's think about fairness for a community that we might not be a part of, but that we see the value in elevating. So elevating an issue like this, I would bet there are ways that it could be a potential thing to think about within your state. Yeah.
I just was going to point out, Melissa Peeler typed into the chat. Our church supports a group called, and we have church members who are members of MICA. Do you have MICA in Mississippi?
We don't have.
I can't remember what it stands for, but it's basically a way for Idlewild church members to get involved interdenominationally. So there's MICA chapter, MICA groups all over different churches, and they can come together on issues that are politically sensitive without actually exposing your church name to it. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, so, because that's how you vote.
Memphis Interfaith Coalition for Action and Hope.
I was gonna say, MICA is a Glenville grassroots organizing group.
Yeah.
That MICA is particular to Memphis, but they've got them all over the interfaith organizing groups all over the United States, whether it's Glenville or what was the one we had in Lawrence? There's another one. I can't remember the name.
National has one.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if y'all found this, but having been a part of different congregations in different states and been on staff of some congregations back in, especially my seminary days, some of us in highly educated white church life have sort of overcorrected on the whole question of what political involvement looks like. I think we have a lot of good, positive sensitivity around not wanting to cross constitutional lines and do things that we don't find holy. We want to be careful not to use our holy spaces to settle scores or to do partisan work, and we have a distaste for the way some congregations use their church spaces to do what we find to be not church work and not, the kind of thing that we come together around. But I think that we've overcorrected in the sense that it's given us some timidity about engaging in places where actually we are invited to engage, and things about, like a redistricting process, or the way that, power is being meted out in a city like Memphis or in a state like Tennessee. I think we have a place in all of that. I think there's a place for us to be without being heavy-handed, without being distasteful, without being partisan, without, coming in with a kugel. I think there's a way for us to engage. And I don't know if y'all have noticed that, but I've noticed a timidity that I think is informed in a healthy place of us not wanting to overstep, but it causes us to not be nearly as impactful in our own backyard as we might otherwise be. Groups like y'all just mentioned are a great way to kind of scratch that itch and come out of that shell a little bit. We have in Tennessee and Mississippi, as you all know, a pretty long history of political violence. And when you talk about anti-racism work, I know that you all have talked about how do we handle that history. And what do we do about it? And of course, there's this whole debate that's going on right now around this concept of critical race theory, which we're reckoning with in all the states where we work as the SPLC, where we're lobbying departments of education and legislatures not to pass resolutions that would prevent the teaching of basic history, because race history is so interwoven into places like Memphis and into places like where I live in Mississippi, that we wouldn't want to make the ridiculous move at this time in history to discourage that type of teaching. But of course, some of you are aware that what is actually technically critical race theory is not the type of thing that takes place in school classrooms at the K through 12 level. Those are kind of advanced post-secondary concerns. But along those lines of what it means to deal with that history, we're working on a kind of it's very much in development. We've begun conversations with the Mississippi Department of the Humanities and the William Winter Center at the University of Mississippi to talk about opposing political violence. And the way that we're going to do that is by bringing together academics from across the state of Mississippi to give citizen-based things you could do in a public library, things you could do to take this history out into communities, to bring people up to speed with the political violence of their own neighborhoods. There are things that happen in Clinton, Mississippi that we didn't talk about openly until just in the last couple of months. The floodgates that have opened in the wake of the George Floyd murder has got us talking about our history in ways that we just haven't thought about before. So what we're going to try to do is to go into communities across the state of Mississippi and bring them up close and personal with the very particularized history of where they are and some of the issues that they might not have seen, or some of the historical facts that might have been kind of swept away. But then to couple that with folks who are doing good organizing work in those spaces, to couple that with stories of what are they doing in a pro-democracy way or in a positive way that can sort of give people not only a touch of history, but maybe an example of how they could get involved in their own backyard, or maybe some group that they could support, or people they could just get to know. And I'm excited about that, and that stems from this effort of trying to creatively find ways to get a state like Mississippi to reckon with some of these things without being overtly political or without beating somebody over the head with it, but inviting people into this space of learning. Because what we suspect, and we'll see if this is true, it's only a hypothesis now, what we suspect is you can invite people into a space to learn more about the history of their community a little bit easier than you can to come at them with some type of political campaign or some other methodology. So it'll be interesting to see how it works out. I'm very excited to hear from some of the academics in terms of how do we take their work, which for the moment is sort of limited to their university classroom, and bring it to a larger audience. So that's something that we're excited about. You all are also similar to us. I know that everybody in the South tends to look at Tennessee, tends to look down at Mississippi and say, well, at least we're not Mississippi. But it occurred to me when I was driving up here yesterday that all of these issues that we're working on at the SPLC in Mississippi are issues that would have resonance in a state like Tennessee. So we're not as far removed as you might sometimes like to think. One of those places is Medicaid expansion. We have hundreds of thousands of people in both of our states that can't get insurance, and they're part of this class of what we call the working poor, where they're working, sometimes multiple jobs, but they make just enough to not qualify for health coverage. And you all are fully aware of the way that medical debt is just wrecking households and sending people to bankruptcy. And it's only gotten worse during this time of the pandemic. Well, we formed a coalition that we were pleased to have a lot of physician groups, doctor groups, and the Lung Association, Heart Association, cancer groups, and some of us nonprofit do-gooder groups to come together around a Medicaid expansion ballot initiative, which we launched back in May of this year. Well, we were excited because we had anticipated a $9 million budget to make that successful in Mississippi. We had performed 3 polls, and what we saw was a very clear path to victory. And we had $5 million of our $9 million budget already secured on the day that we announced the campaign. And having worked on a lot of campaigns, statewide and others, that is just a rare thing to have. Now, our campaigns are somewhat cheaper in Mississippi than they are in Tennessee, but nonetheless, when you're over 50% and you're 2 years out, it felt like we were really on to something. 2 days later, the Mississippi Supreme Court took away the ballot initiative process in Mississippi. And so since that time, we have turned our efforts towards that kind of baseline persuasion of trying to see what does it take for our state's leadership to reconcile themselves to this concept. Can we do it through some branding exercises? Does it help to take, Obamacare out of the name? Does it help not to call it Medicaid expansion? Has that been too politicized? Do we just call it healthcare? So we've started to play around with that and have some really interesting conversations. And one of the great things that has happened is by inviting some of these physician groups into the strategic thinking around that, they're having sway in ways that we could not. They're having an influence that we were incapable of as some of our more, I guess you would call it, progressive nonprofit entities. And an example of that is they are in the process of the State Medical Association, and Cliff, you might not know this, they're in the process of endorsing Medicaid expansion without a work requirement, without some of the things that have kind of gummed it up in the past, just a pure expansion. And as bad as it was to lose the ballot initiative, as bad as it was to lose that particular part of the campaign, I don't think we would be where we are had it not been for launching that ballot initiative when we did, and a timing sort of aligning with doctors thinking critically about how they deal with poor folks in the state of Mississippi, and hospitals thinking about that, and people throughout the whole, medical infrastructure. I guess I thought about telling you all that because, again, it's very hard for me to think in terms of what does it mean for a guy like me to be engaged in anti-racist work in a state like Mississippi, if not for thinking about hundreds of thousands of people that don't have medical insurance, that aren't able to take care of the most basic healthcare needs that their family has, that has to use places like our emergency room as their doctor's office. And I know those aren't totally new concepts. That type of service has been baked into the church in some way or another for a long time. But I thought maybe walking you through some of those different things that we're doing might spark some thought along different ways to enter this conversation, to think more deeply about anti-racist work as something other than just this or just that, but thinking, beyond just maybe the bumper sticker headlines. I was curious though, and I asked Cliff, I didn't know how much back and forth y'all did. In my Sunday school class, we do a lot of crosstalk, and somebody will throw some things out there and we'll chew on it a little bit together. I was kind of just curious to know, having gone through the class that Cliff mentioned, for those of you who did, and perhaps if you didn't go through the class, you've been thinking about some of these things in another context. But to think about what does it mean to be anti-racist church people here at Idlewild, and what do we do with that? I was curious to know if y'all have identified any fears or challenges. I heard Cliff mention tension. That's a very ambiguous phrase. I was curious to know, what have y'all bumped up against in thinking through that as a congregation? Because I'm curious, because those are the types of conversations we're trying to spark across the state, and y'all might have something that we can learn from. Yes, ma'am.
Are you familiar with the new book that's come out, How the Word Began? It's by a fairly young author who went to Davidson. I can't think of his name, but I've just finished that book, and it is a novel. If we could get everybody to read that book, we would really solve a lot of problems, because school teachers, places where they honor the Civil War, there's so much misinformation given, and we need to correct that. And when you read that book, you just get on fire, but we've got to do something about the misinformation that is is going around and has been going around. And if people read that book and saw how we've been misled, it would really help a lot.
And that's how the word began.
That's it.
How the word, okay. Yeah, you know, it is tough to think about. Well, first of all, just observationally, and again, nothing profound here. I don't know that I recall us ever feeling quite as divided as we are now. And I'm a relatively young guy, I know that. But having been involved in politics, including some pretty, I don't know, 2000 was a pretty weird political year, and living on Capitol Hill at that time and seeing competing protests at the state Supreme Court and Capitol every day. I don't feel like I'm a total neophyte to political rancor. But we're divided in ways that I think are more extreme than maybe what we've seen in quite some time. And to think about bridging some of that or taking some steps forward, when we can't even agree on reality, that presents a very particular challenge. When we can't even agree if we have a troubled history. And it sounds like that book digs into that, kind of confronts that in a way that is helpful. That's a real challenge, to get people to let their guard down, to even be open to maybe considering a part of history they hadn't been exposed to before. Yes, ma'am.
I was gonna say, I only got the privilege to be part of the end of those conversations, because I came on board in May. But I think one of the big things that I heard being lifted again and again was, how do we bring our congregation and our community on board if they haven't had this same experience that we have of wrestling with the exact things that you were talking about wrestling about. So this is a closed group that's had this experience and it's changed us. And how do we open that to the entire congregation? How do we engage the broader Memphis community in the conversations that we're having? Because not only are they impactful to us individually, to us as a congregation, but we truly believe they can change our community in positive ways. So that balance between the interpersonal, how we're changed, and how we change our structures, our societal structures, and how we do that without alienating and pushing people away in this incredibly divided time when, like, buzzwords will turn people off and immediately they stop listening because it's such high tension right now.
Well, and what you've described, I think, is such a challenge. It's kind of like explaining book club to someone who's not in book club, or explaining when you read something that really moves you, trying to encapsulate that and share it with someone who might not have read it or might not have time to, or who knows. And I don't know the answer to that. I think that's one of those things we chew on and we think about creatively. But I do think, I think a lot about how do we demystify some of this? Because I do think in some ways we have made engaging hard things so specialized and complicated that it intimidates people from even getting involved at all. And so I wonder if part of our role in the church isn't in part to simplify, not to whitewash, not to suggest these aren't complicated issues, and certainly not to suggest that we don't have a lot to learn, but to maybe approach these things in ways that invite people into the conversation and let them feel okay not having any answers, just coming at it with questions. And maybe how do you create a space where you normalize some of our ignorance, some of our bad approaches to this stuff? Because we have to get to some point where we can have the conversation more broadly than the people who are really fired up about these things. Because people who are really fired up already tend to be engaging in one way or the other.
Yeah.
That's not really your mission field. It's a question of how do we bring more people into the conversation. And that's a tough one. And I think it's worth, I don't know if y'all do this, but I think it's worth bringing that question into the room as often as possible. Because I don't know what the answer is, but I wonder if you don't get at it by continuing to say, do we have an answer for this yet? Are we getting any further than the people who just keep showing up here on Thursday night? Yeah.
I was gonna say, I think the book that you're referencing is How the Word is Passed, A Reckoning with the History of Slavery Across America by Clint Smith, who's a native of New Orleans.
Yeah,
So he's looking at history and memory and memorialization, the statues that we put up and how we remember things. I put it in the chat if anybody's interested.
We have a note from the chat.
Pardon?
There's something in the chat.
That's what I put in there.
It's P-A-S-S-E-D, passed.
Yeah.
Oh, Melissa Peeler, there's a real tension. We had members state they were leaving the church over BLM sign that we put on Union. Yes, that is true. The session shared several letters of members who were concerned about our sign that said Black Lives Matter. By that time that we were trying to join in solidarity, there were political forces that were aligning BLM with the organization in New York, which is very controversial. And so, and unfortunately, for those of us who believe that Black Lives Matter, in the terms of the police brutality that has been happening, that message got lost. And unfortunately, we lost church members over that because they decided that we were supporting a neo-Marxist liberal terrorist group out of New York.
well, yeah, I don't think that's a unique story.
No.
I mean, I don't know how comforting it is to hear this, but, you all know as well as I do that over the course of the last couple of years, we've seen families interacting in different ways, more tension introduced into some common things that we would never have even dreamed would be dividing us. There's deep division over how we're approaching a pandemic, how we're approaching a virus, which is kind of strange. I mean, some of you saw our approach historically to other pandemics and viruses, and as divided as we might have been in other ways, there was some uniformity in approach there, some community concern that sort of aligned us. And the specter of race and the way it was introduced in this very public murder has us all reading things and talking about things and entering into uncomfortable spaces in a way I don't think we've ever seen before. There's no easy thing to be said about how a part of it, the church can decide to do some grand gesture of, solidarity, and that isolates members. There's no simple answer to that, obviously. And I didn't come here to answer questions, but just to kind of uplift them. I'll tell you what we've practiced though, because as you might imagine, a group like Southern Poverty Law Center, we've had a lot of consultants come through in the last year and a half. And we've done a lot of navel gazing and a lot of kind of looking at ourselves in the mirror about maybe where we weren't living up to some of our charges. And one of the things that we've kind of committed to is to keep, when there is tension that isolates people and when there is some type of blow up, to try our best to keep that, to not ignore it. So if you put up a Black Lives Matter banner and it isolates members of the church, I think we might think that it's polite and something we might have done historically in the church to sort of let that divide happen and we all just kind of move on. But you mentioned something about how some things got lost in the wash. And I think it's helpful if there's going to be a division, sometimes division is impossible to avoid. But to have a division that is unexamined, I think it's a real problem. And I don't know that we get better in terms of how we do this kind of work if we don't live with it for a second and kind of poke around and, okay, well, how did we get to this point? How did we come to that decision? What was the reason that we went the way that we did? And what have we heard from the folks who went the other way? At the end of that, it may just be decided. There's some irreconcilable things going on here. It's time for some folks to just go separate ways, and maybe we need to make our peace with that, because that's sometimes just the answer. But I'll bet that there are some folks who generally like the fact that the banner went up and that might not have had a very deep conversation about, well, why did we do that at church? What does that have to do? It might be worth poking around in that just to make sure that there's some common story here that comes out of it, so that people at least have some sense of why and what. And that's tough work. That's not pleasant all the time, for sure.
Jimmy had asked in the chat, he was curious how many families we lost, and I don't have an answer for you, Jimmy, I'm sorry. But I can think about a handful of some actually long-term prominent members of the church who decided to move on. We also had a transition in our head of staff as well. So, you know, how many people were actually just considering moving on anyway, but they found it could be a tough call. But anyway.
Well, I don't know if y'all have felt this, but sometimes I've struggled with the futility of feeling like you want to do something about these big pressing issues that are happening around us, and you want to feel like you're making an impact, and then sometimes it can feel so self-defeating when you're fighting your friends, or when you're bickering internally, or when you think, man, we can't even come together on this as a church. How on earth can we do anything that goes beyond who we are? And as I've said many times today, you're not going to have me back. But I don't have a big answer to that. But I think there is a certain commonality to that. If you're feeling that, you're not by yourself, because I can guarantee you that, I don't know if you're familiar with the Southern Poverty Law Center or not before I came here today, but we have a pretty big street reputation for being really good in some of these spaces. And I can tell you, we have really been in our heads about some of this futility of being at each other's throat, and how if we can't align on some basic things, how on earth can we reach the communities that we purport to reach? And so I don't think we need to beat ourselves up as a church if we have the same challenges. I think sometimes we hit those challenges and it causes us to disengage, or it causes us to just move to something else. And I think that would be a real mistake. I think that would be a real sad thing to happen, especially for a place like y'all that I think has the potential to be a real leader in these areas. Yes, ma'am.
I'm in the writers group, and we, got to write a short story on race. So I started with Google, race rights, and they started in the 1700s, and just kind of followed it through. And we tend to think, at least my age, and I'm older than you are, that the problem started in the 60s, or came to a boil in the 60s, but they didn't. And I don't think the church has ever taken a really, really active role in any of these, going back all these years. And we're looking for ways to solve it all at once, and we gotta look at a way to solve it with a small issue. Just my opinion.
And then to add to that, part of our problem that we created for ourselves is that we came to the conclusion that we solved those problems of the 60s by the 1970s, and now we can move on. And it came back to haunt us with George Floyd.
And Brandon, to your point, one of the things that was most interesting, I thought, about that, looking inward, moving forward class, was we were doing these racial roadmaps of individuals, talking about kind of their reckoning with race and when they had encountered issues that marked them. But we did a racial roadmap of the church of Iowa, and as a new member, it was incredibly informative. And we found documents and letters that revealed Idlewild's own painful past in a place where there's this kind of this pride in this, where Idlewild sees itself as coming down, in the annals of history. And there were some mistakes made. There were things done that were hurtful and painful to the Black community in Memphis, and just like everybody else, white folks at Idlewild misstepped. And we had to kind of reckon with that and tell them the truth about our past and telling that story honestly. And how you reckon with that in 2021 in the face of all these issues and wanting to move forward, I think is important. But I think your 2 points together make me think about that racial roadmap of the church and the importance of telling the truth about that as we think about how we move forward.
I think about the persistence of these issues, that we tend to kind of drop in on a place in history and presume well, this was a story of that, but going back to this, 1700s reminds us, these are persistent challenges that come up and we deal with it on a, I don't think anybody wants to hear when you're talking about hard work that it might be something you live with, or that it might be a process that you work on as part of your life, that it might be something that you live with that you don't resolve overnight, that it might be a commitment that you take on. But I've always thought, I don't know about y'all, but my faith is such that I think of it being a developing thing, constantly a work in progress. I don't ever feel this sense of achievement. I don't ever feel like, well, I've kind of hit the finish line on this. I look at it as a developing thing, and I've wondered if we as people of faith, who are sort of aware of that theological truth of faith as something that we take on, that develops over time, and that we get some moments of insight into, we have inbreakings, but we don't ever fully arrive, that it's something we are working out, that it's being worked out on us over the course of our lives. To me, that's a great framework for these hard conversations that we're trying to, and we do have something to bring to that, people of faith. We have a framework for that. It's like, well, that's how we talk about faith. So why should we expect that this thorny issue of race and reconciliation would be any easier than that? We know what it means to take on something that we don't fully understand, that we sort of commit to with the recognition that it's ongoing. I don't know, to me, I just think maybe that's one of the ways that we as church people can maybe drop some of the temperature down on some of these things and say, well, this isn't the only thing in the world that takes a longer commitment than one book club or one season of a class. Maybe this is going to be something we reckon with for a while, and it just needs to become a part of the overall faith work we're doing as people in the church. But the people don't want to hear that, I don't think. It's a tough sale to add one more thing to the life list. Yes, ma'am.
I think Iowa has a history of having lost some of its strongest members because of questions that were controversial. And I think maybe we now have leadership that is open and willing to move and courageous about taking new steps. I think we have an atmosphere that is a lot more favorable than it's ever been to do some of the things that we've done. We've really been through a history of losing some of the people that we counted on for the biggest contributions and being heads of leadership roles. And I think that's different now. And I think the people we have leading us are not so reactive.
I think it's an exciting place. Really, I think there's a lot for y'all to take pride in as a congregation. It's a vibrant congregation, in my opinion. I mean, what Cliff has told me about the conversations you've had, that alone is creating a safe space to have hard conversations. And that may sound oversimplified, but that's a very real way that we as church folk can grapple with some of these big things. And I do encourage you to not be too fearful about that, to not be too afraid of tension. I do think tension is part of this. I don't hear tension as a bad word. I guess I should say that. I can tell you the work that we do, we just kind of have come to terms with the fact that tension is going to be a part of it. And we might lose some folks along the way in the work. And some folks might just go do it in a beautiful way. It's just a different way. It's not a judgment thing, but a little bit of bravery around that. I think as people of faith, maybe we need to be a little less tongue-tied, be okay with exploring some of these things, recognize that it might lead us to some tough places, but what on earth is easy about this whole New Testament thing that we keep dragging around with us for thousands of years? I mean, this is tough stuff. It's challenging, but I think it's an exciting place. I think what y'all are doing, just
People come to Iowa, new people come to Iowa because we have a reputation for moving out.
Yeah.
And we've been hurt by people who left us, but we've also gained people who specifically came to Iowa for the leadership that they thought I well had in the community.
That's exactly the point I was about to make. I mean, it's hard to quantify that, right? But I guarantee you, there are people who are in this church now because there was a Black Lives Matter sign on Union Avenue. I promise you that it's true. And, you know, so that your good word about not being fearful and recognizing that there's a good word in that too, and there's good news. There may be changes, and not to dismiss anybody who leaves because they're always sad, but I do think it happens, and there's energy around that forward push. I think we're about it.
I think we're at past our time.
Yes, and Melissa and getting great props on the chat. I don't want to ignore anybody there. I applaud the speaker in the discussion. Julie, most people loved your comment. So this is a great way to end. This is our last summer forum of the summer. And I'd like to remind everybody that next Sunday, August 14th or 15th? 15th. Actually, sorry, it's a two-step process. August 14th on Saturday is the kickoff to Rally Day. There'll be activities here at the church. Just watch for the announcements. And then Sunday is Rally Day, which means that you can learn about outreach opportunities to get involved with at the church, but also what the Sunday school offerings will be and ways to get involved in the church that way. So we hope you'll come back. We'll probably be set up in the gym, but that's again about to be decided. We have to socially distance. So with that said, thank you all so much for making this a great summer forum. And I will close out the meeting. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Everyone at home.